The sound wasn't a beep. It was a scream. Continuous, high-pitched electronic wail that sliced through the pressurized air of Trauma Bay 1. 64 beats per minute. Dropping. 58. I said, "Clear the line." A voice boomed, deep and serrated with command. It didn't belong to a doctor. It belonged to the man standing at the foot of the stretcher, his chest decorated with rows of colorful ribbons that caught the harsh overhead halogen glare. General Hannon. 3 stars on his collar, terror in his eyes, and absolutely no business being inside a sterile field. "He is not stabilizing," the young resident Dr. Eamon Vane stammered. His gloved hands were slick with sweat, slipping against the plastic of the intubation blade. "Sir, I can't. His pressure is bottoming out." "Then fix it, son. That is a direct order. You do not let him die on this table." 52. Maren Kestler didn't look at the general. She didn't look at the panicked resident. Her world had narrowed down to the tactile feedback of her own fingertips. She stood on the right side of the bed, her body a rigid line of discipline in a room dissolving into chaos. She was 54 years old, with silver hair pulled back so tightly it strained the pale skin at her temples, and hands that looked like they had been scrubbed with steel wool every day for 3 decades. She wasn't watching the monitor. She was watching the patient's neck. The man on the table was listed only as Dor John Sierra, but everyone in the room knew who he was. Commander Declan Rook, Navy SEAL, high-value asset. He had been flown in 4 minutes ago, bypassing triage, bypassing protocol, bypassing everything except death itself. "Compressions," Maren said. Her voice was low, devoid of panic. It was the sound of gravel shifting under a heavy boot. "Dr. Vane, we are losing capture." Vane froze. He looked at the general, then at the monitor. The waveform was flattening into a chaotic, squiggly line. Ventricular fibrillation. "Charge to 200. Vane squeaked, his voice cracking. "Clear." The room didn't clear. The general stepped closer, his knuckles white as he gripped the rail of the bed, invading the space where the respiratory tech was trying to bag the patient. "General, you need to step back," Maren said. She didn't shout. She didn't plead. She simply stated a physical necessity. The general turned his head, his eyes narrowing as they landed on her. For the first time, he seemed to register her presence. Not as a clinician, but as an obstacle. A middle-aged woman in blue scrubs that were slightly too large, with a faded eye badge that had flipped over, hiding her name. "I am not leaving my man," Hannon growled. "Shock him." Vane triggered the paddles. The body of the commander arched violently off the mattress, a heavy thud of muscle and bone slamming back down. Silence, then the alarm resumed. Same tone, no rhythm. Again, the general barked. Maren's eyes were locked on the patient's jugular vein. It was distended, roping out against the thick muscle of his neck like a gorged snake. She reached out, her fingers pressing gently against the commander's wrist, ignoring the chaos around her. She felt it. Or rather, she felt the absence of it. On the inspiration of the ventilator, when the machine forced air into his lungs, the faint thrum of his pulse vanished completely. Pulsus paradoxus. "It's not an electrical issue," Maren said, her voice cutting through the noise of the charging defibrillator. "Stop shocking him. You're cooking the heart muscle. Who is speaking?" The general demanded, whipping around. "Nurse Kestler," Maren replied, not looking up. She moved her hand to the patient's chest, placing her palm flat over the sternum. It felt hard, wooden. "Look at his neck veins, doctor. Look at the pressures. It's tamponade. He's bleeding into the sac around his heart. If you shock him again, you kill him." Dr. Vane blinked, sweat dripping from his nose onto his mask. He looked terrified. He was a second-year resident, talented but fragile, and the presence of a 3-star general had reduced his medical judgment to ash. The monitor says VFib. Vane stammered. The monitor is reading artifact from the interference because his heart is being squeezed to death, Maren said. She looked up then, her eyes dark and heavy, the skin beneath them bruised with exhaustion. He needs a needle, now. Subsiphoid approach. Drain the sac. No, the general interrupted. His voice was a door slamming shut. Colonel Stryker is 10 minutes out. He is the best cardiothoracic surgeon in the Navy. He gave specific orders. Stabilize and wait. Maren felt the heat rise in her neck. A familiar burn she had suppressed thousands of times. Sir, in 10 minutes, Commander Rourke will be brain dead. His heart cannot beat because it is drowning in his own blood. Are you a doctor? Hannon asked. The question was a weapon. I am the charge nurse of this trauma unit, Maren said, standing her ground. So that's a no, Hannon sneered. He turned back to Vane. Doctor, do not puncture my operative's chest based on the guess of a nurse. You stabilize him. You keep that heart beating until Stryker walks through those doors. Do you understand me? Vane swallowed hard. He looked at Maren, his eyes begging for forgiveness, then looked back at the general. Yes, sir. Continuing ACLS protocol. Charging to 300. The Maren watched Vane's shake as he dialed up the jawls. She looked down at the commander. He was graying. The oxygen was failing to reach his tissues because the pump was jammed. Every time they shocked him, they were just assaulting a dying organ. She saw the scare on the commander's shoulder, an old, jagged line from some past war. She saw the wedding band tattooed on his ring finger. A life, a history, ending right here because a general wanted a colonel to be the hero, and a resident was too scared to be a doctor. Clear! Vane yelled. The body jumped. The smell of singed hair and ozone filled the small bay. Maren stepped back, her hands balling into fists at her sides. She felt the tremor in her left eyelid, the only tell she ever allowed herself. The monitor was screaming a flatline now. Acetol. The heart had stopped quivering. It had simply given up. He's flat. The respiratory tech whispered. Epinephrine. The general shouted, pointing a finger at Vane. Push everything you have. They were flogging a corpse. Maren knew it. The physics were simple. Fluid takes up space. If the fluid is trapped around the heart cannot fill. If it cannot fill, it cannot pump. No amount of drugs or electricity changes volume. She looked at the clock on the wall. The second hand swept past the 12. Colonel Stryker was 9 minutes away. Commander Rourke had less than 2. Maren looked at the crash cart, the pericardiocentesis kit, a long grand gauge needle and a syringe, sat on the bottom shelf, sealed in sterile plastic. It was right at there, 8 feet away. She looked at the general. He was red-faced, shouting orders that made no physiological sense. Commanding the body to live through sheer force of will, he was a man used to the world bending to his authority. But death had no rank. The monitor let out a singular, unending tone. Beep. Fix it. Hannon roared, slamming his hand on the mattress next to the dying soldier's head. Maren took a breath. It was a slow, deep inhale that expanded her ribs against the tightness of her scrubs. She felt the weight of the room, the weight of her career, the weight of the mortgage she paid alone since her husband passed. If she moved, she would be court-martialed. She would lose her license. She might go to prison for assaulting a patient if he died, but if she stood still, the silence would be the only thing left. She unclasped her hands. The friction of her skin against skin made a dry, rasping sound that no one else heard. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was just waiting for the noise to get loud enough to hide what she had to do. The chaos in Trauma Bay 1 was a physical thing. It had weight and texture. It was composed of General Hannon's shouting, the shrill, unending alarm of the cardiac monitor, and the useless, frantic weeping of Dr. Vane, who had finally broken under the pressure. "He's gone, sir! He's gone!" Vane cried out, Dropping the paddles, they clattered against the linoleum floor, a sound like plastic bones breaking. "Pick them up!" Hannon roared, his face a mask of purple rage. He grabbed Vane by the scrub top, hauling the young man close, shaking him like a rag doll. "You do not quit until I tell you to quit. That is a United States naval officer. You will shock him until the battery dies." The general's back was turned to the patient. He was focused entirely on the hierarchy, on the chain of command, on forcing a subordinate to obey an impossible order. Maren moved. She didn't run. Running attracted the eye. She moved with the fluid, practice efficiency of 30 years on the floor. She was a ghost in her own ER, invisible because she was considered irrelevant. She took 2 steps to the crash cart. Her hand, the one with the slight tremor, steadied instantly as her fingers found the latch of the pericardiocentesis kit. She didn't look at the label. She knew the shape of the box by heart. Snap. The hard plastic seal broke. The sound was sharp, like a twig snapping in a winter forest, but it was swallowed instantly by Hannon's bellowing. "I will have your license, Vane. I will have you court-martialed for cowardice." Maren slid the long, 6-inch spinal needle out of its sterile sheath. It was a terrifying instrument, thick-gauge steel designed to plunge deep into the chest cavity. In the hands of a novice, it was a murder weapon. In Maren's hands, it was the only key left to the lock. She grabbed a bottle of betadine from the tray. She didn't bother with sterile drapes. There was no time for the ritual of medicine, only the mechanics of survival. She stepped up to the left side of the stretcher. Opposite the general, opposite the noise. Commander Rourke lay gray and still. His chest was motionless. The ventilator pushed air in, and the chest rose mechanically, a cruel mimicry of life. But under the skin, the blood was stagnant. Maren splashed the brown iodine over the subxiphoid area, the soft depression just below the breastbone. It pooled in the hollow of his ribs. Vane saw her. Over the general's shoulder, the resident's wide, wet eyes locked onto Maren. He saw the needle in her hand. He saw the intent. His mouth opened to scream, to warn the general, to stop the insanity of a nurse stabbing a patient without an order. Maren held his gaze. She didn't blink. She didn't shake her head. She just looked at him with a ferocity that froze the words in his throat. It was a look that said, "If you speak, you kill him." Vane's jaw snapped shut. He looked down. Maren turned to the body. She placed her left thumb, the one with the thick callus on the pad from years of opening ampules, on the tip of the commander's xiphoid process. She found the landmark. She angled the needle, 45 degrees, aiming toward the left shoulder. "Forgive me," she thought. Not to the general, not to God, but to the man on the table, in case she missed. She drove the needle in. It went through the skin with a pop, through the subcutaneous fat, through the fascia. Maren stopped breathing. She advanced the steel slowly, feeling the resistance of the muscle, searching for the distinct, gritty sensation of the pericardial sac. It was like piercing a piece of thick leather. The general was still screaming. "Charge the damn machine, Vane. Do it now, pop." She felt it give. The loss of resistance. She was inside the sac. Her hand moved to the plunger of the 60C syringe attached to the needle. She pulled back. If she drew bright red blood, she had hit the ventricle. If she had killed him, if she drew air, she'd hit the lung. She had killed him. She pulled. Dark, maroon fluid swirled into the barrel. Old blood. Non-clotting. The pressure that was crushing the heart. "Got you," she whispered. The sound was no louder than a breath. She pulled harder, filling the syringe 20 cc's, 30, 40. The fluid rushed out, black, red, and heavy. And then, a sound cut through the general's tirade. Beep. Hannon froze mid-sentence. His arm was still raised, pointing at the defibrillator. Beep. A pause. Beep. The rhythm on the monitor changed. The flatline shattered, replaced by a jagged climbing QRS complex. It wasn't perfect, it was ugly and wide. But it was there. 50 beats per minute. 55. The general slowly lowered his arm. He turned around, his boots squeaking on the floor. He looked at the monitor, confusion clouding his fury. He has a rhythm. Pressure is rising, Vane whispered, staring at the screen in disbelief. Systolic is 60. 70. Hannon looked down at the patient. And then he saw it. He saw the nurse. He saw the silver-haired woman standing calmly at the bedside. Her hand steady as a stone, holding a syringe filled with dark fluid that was connected to a needle buried deep in the commander's chest. The silence that slammed into the room was heavier than the noise had ever been. It was a vacuum. Maren didn't look up. She unscrewed the full syringe, the valve clicking softly, and squirted the blood into a kidney basin. It hit the metal with a wet slap. She reattached the syringe and drew back again. More blood came. What? Hannon's voice was a dry rasp. He sounded like he had been punched in the throat. What are you doing? Maren watched the monitor. 80 beats per minute. A strong sinus rhythm. The commander's chest heaved, not from the machine, but from his own diaphragm fighting to take a breath. I am saving his life, General, Maren said. Her voice was flat, metallic. She kept her eyes on the syringe. And I would appreciate it if you stepped back. You are blocking the light. The disruption was total. The hierarchy had not just been broken, it had been inverted. A 3-star general stood impotent at the foot of the bed, while a nurse with a needle held the center of the universe. Hannon's face went from purple to a chalky, dangerous white. He took a step toward her. The ribbons on his chest jingled softly. You assaulted a patient, he hissed. The shock was fading, replaced by a cold. You predatory realization of what he was witnessing. You performed a surgical procedure without an order. That is criminal battery. Maren didn't flinch. She pulled the last of the fluid, nearly 200 cc's in total. She withdrew the needle in one smooth motion, applying gauze to the puncture site. He has a pulse, Maren said, finally looking up. Her eyes met Hannon's. There was no fear in them. There was only a tired, ancient weight. She wiped a smudge of blood from her thumb onto her scrub pants. He has a pulse, she repeated. You can court-martial me later. But right now, he needs a surgeon, not a speech. The double doors of the trauma bay burst open. Status report. A new voice barked. Sharp, confident, arrogant. Colonel Stryker strode in, flanked by 2 fellows. He was crisp, clean, and 10 minutes late. He looked at the monitor, then at the general, and finally at Maren, who was holding the bloody syringe like a smoking gun. General, Stryker asked, sensing the thickness in the air. I thought you said he was coding. Hannon stared at Maren. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The vein in his temple throbbed. He looked at the live monitor, then back at the woman who had defied him. He was, Hannon said softly. Maren placed the syringe on the tray. The metal clinked, the sound of a gavel hitting a block. She stepped back from the bed, fading toward the wall, trying to become invisible again. But it was too late. The line had been crossed. The ink was dry. She had saved the man, but she had humiliated the authority. And in the military, humiliation was a sin far worse than death. Colonel Stryker didn't ask what happened. He read the room like he read a CT scan. Layer by layer, identifying the pathology instantly. He saw the resident vein trembling against the wall, his career flashing before his eyes. He saw General Hannon, a man who commanded entire fleets, looking strangely diminished, his chest heaving with suppressed adrenaline. And he saw the nurse, the older woman with the silver hair, wiping down the Mayo stand as if she were cleaning up a spilled cup of coffee rather than the aftermath of a near-fatal cardiac event. Stryker moved to the bedside. He placed his hands on Commander Rourke's chest. He felt the strong, bounding pulse against his palm. Who tapped the pericardium? Stryker asked. His voice was low, deceptively calm. He didn't look up. He ran his thumb over the small, red puncture mark just below the xiphoid. Perfect entry angle. Avoided the pleural lining. Missed the liver margin by millimeters. Vane opened his mouth, but no sound came out. I asked a question, Stryker said, finally looking up. His eyes were pale blue, cold as glacier water. Vane, did you grow a spine in the 10 minutes I was in the elevator? No, sir, Vane whispered, his gaze darting to Maren. Stryker followed the look. He turned his body fully toward Maren. For the first time, he really saw her. He took in the fraying hem of her scrub pants, the sensible, worn-out shoes, and the ID badge that simply said Keistiliol RNU. Stryker asked. The word was heavy with disbelief. You performed an invasive surgical procedure on a Tier 1 asset. Maren stopped cleaning. She folded the bloody rag with precise, geometric corners. The patient was in tamponade colonal. He had lost cardiac output. He had less than a minute. You are not a surgeon, Stryker said. Stepping closer, he invaded her personal space, using his height to intimidate. You are not even a resident. You are a nurse. You do not hold a scalpel. You do not hold a needle of that gauge. Do you have any idea the liability you just created? I know the physiology, sir, Maren replied. Her voice remained steady, though she felt a familiar, sharp pain behind her eyes. The tension headache that always arrived when she had to apologize for being right. Fluid inhibits filling. Drainage restores it. The liability of a dead patient seemed higher than the liability of a surviving one. Stryker's jaw tightened. He hated insubordination, but he hated being outsmarted more. He looked back at the syringe full of dark blood sitting in the basin. It was undeniable proof of competence. General, Stryker said, turning to Hannon. Did you authorize this? The room went still. This was the pivot point. The moment where truth and rank collided. General Hannon straightened his tunic. He regained his composure, the mask of command slipping back into place. He looked at Maren, his eyes hard and unyielding. He saw a woman who had disobeyed a direct order. He saw a civilian who had humiliated him in front of his subordinate. The situation was chaotic, Hannon said smoothly. The team reacted. Stryker raised an eyebrow. Nurse Kestler, Hannon said, his voice dropping an octave, acted outside the chain of command. She endangered the patient. She was lucky. That is all. Maren felt the betrayal like a physical blow. Lucky, 30 years of trauma medicine. 10 years in this specific ER, thousands of nights holding hands while lights faded from eyes. Reduced to luck. Sir. Maren started. Quiet. Hannon snapped. Stryker looked between them. He understood the dynamic instantly. The general was embarrassed. The nurse was the scapegoat. It was the oldest story in the military: mission accomplished, collateral damage discarded. Get him upstairs. Stryker ordered the fellows behind him, dismissing the issue. OR2 is prepped. We need to open him up and find the bleeder before it tamponades again. Move. The team sprang into action. They swarmed the bed, disconnecting Maren's leads, pushing her monitors aside. They took ownership of the body she had just pulled back from the abyss. As they wheeled the stretcher toward the doors, Commander Rourke's hand flopped off the side of the rail. Maren instinctively reached out to tuck it back in, a reflex of care she couldn't suppress. Don't touches him, Hannon barked. Maren froze. Her hand hovered inches from the soldier's fingers. You are done here, Hannon said. He stepped in close, lowering his voice so only she could hear. You think you're a hero. You're a liability. You disobeyed a 3-star general. You risked a national asset on a hunch. It wasn't a hunch, Maren whispered. I don't care what it was, Hannon hissed. You are removed from this case. You are to speak to no one about what happened in this room. If I hear a whisper that a nurse cut into my man, I will bury you so deep you won't even be able to get a job checking blood pressure at a pharmacy. Do you understand? Maren looked at him. She saw the fear behind his aggression. He was afraid of the paperwork, afraid of the inquiry, afraid of the question. Why did a nurse have to save him while you watched? I understand, Maren said. Her voice was hollow. Get out of my sight, Hannon said. He turned and followed the stretcher out of the bay. The doors swung shut, the pneumatic hiss sealing the room. Maren was left alone in Trauma Bay 1. The room was a wreck. Wrappers on the floor, bloody gaze, the crash cart open and disarrayed. The silence was deafening now. The monitor was off, the screen black. She walked over to the sink. She turned on the water, letting it run hot. She pumped the soap and began to scrub her hands. She scrubbed hard. She dug her fingernails into her palms. She washed away the betadine, the sweat, the invisible residue of the decision she had made. The door to the hallway opened. It was the charge nurse for the night shift, a younger woman named Sarah, holding a clipboard. Maren, Sarah asked, looking at the mess. What happened in here? Why is General Hannon screaming at the hospital administrator in the hallway? Maren turned off the water. She dried her hands with a paper towel, the friction rough against her skin. She looked at her reflection in the glass of the supply cabinet. She looked old. She looked tired. Nothing, Maren said. Just a code? A code? Who ran it? Dr. Vane, Maren lied. The words tasted like ash. He did a good job. Well, Sarah said, looking uncomfortable. Admin wants to see you now. They said to bring your badge. Maren nodded. She knew what that meant. Suspension. Pending investigation. The wheels of the bureaucracy were already turning to crush the anomaly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled object she had unconsciously picked up from the floor during the chaos. It was a patch. A Velcro patch that had been torn from Commander Rourke's uniform when they cut his shirt off. It was a simple, dark green rectangle. No name, just a symbol of a trident. She rubbed her thumb over the embroidery. The thread was rough, durable. She had saved a ghost. And for that sin, she was about to be erased. Maren placed the patch on the counter, right next to the empty syringe. She straightened her scrub top, took a deep breath that rattled slightly in her chest, and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. The room knew the truth. That would have to be enough. The office of the hospital administrator, Marcus Sterling, smelled of stale coffee and carpet cleaner. It was a windowless box on the first floor, far removed from the blood and noise of the trauma bay. It was a room where careers were dissected in quiet, polite sentences. Maren sat in the low chair across from the desk. She held her hands in her lap, fingers interlaced. She ran her right thumb over the back of her left hand, tracing the faint, jagged white line of a burn scar she had gotten 20 years ago. Not from a war, but from a kitchen accident the night her husband died. It was a nervous habit, a tactile anchor when the world started to spin. The general is furious, Maren, Sterling said. He didn't look angry. He looked exhausted. He was a man who managed spreadsheets, not soldiers, and General Hannon had just bulldozed through his budget meeting. He's threatening to pull the military contract. He's talking about press conferences. He's talking about assault charges. I saved the patient, Maren said. Her voice was steady, but it felt thin in the recycled air. That's not the version on the official report. Sterling sighed, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Maren didn't pick it up. She could read the header upside down. Incident report unauthorized procedural near-miss event. Colonel Stryker's notes indicate that the resident, Dr. Vane, identified the tamponade and was preparing the procedure when you intervened prematurely, Sterling said, choosing his words carefully. The narrative is that you panicked, that you jumped the gun, that you endangered a stabilized patient. Maren felt a cold, hard knot form in her stomach. It wasn't surprise. She had worked in hospitals long enough to know that truth was flexible when liability was involved. Vane had buckled. To save his residency, he had agreed to the lie. To save face, the general had endorsed it. "I didn't panic," Maren said softly. Vane was paralyzed. The patient had no pulse. "I had the work." "It doesn't matter, Maren," Sterling snapped, finally losing his cool. "You are a nurse. You are not credentialed for invasive surgical interventions. Even if you were right, and I'm not saying you weren't, you broke the fundamental rule of this institution. You acted outside your scope, so the rule is more important than the life." Sterling rubbed his temples. "In a courtroom. Yes, in a contract negotiation with the Department of Defense. Absolutely." He leaned back, avoiding her eyes. "You are placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, without pay, pending the results of the internal review board." He slid a plastic tray toward her. "I need your badge." "Maren." The silence returned. It was different from the silence in the trauma bay. That silence had been pregnant with potential, with the fight for life. This silence was sterile and final. It was the sound of a door locking. Maren reached up and unclipped her badge, the plastic rectangle that had defined her existence for 12 years. Charge nurse, trauma, ACLS instructor. She placed it in the tray. It made a hollow clatter. "Go home, Maren," Sterling said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Pray the commander pulls through without complications. If he dies, or if there's an infection, God help you." Maren stood up. Her knees popped. She felt the weight of her 54 years in her lower back. She didn't say goodbye. She didn't defend herself again. She walked out of the office, the burn scar on her hand throbbing in time with her heart. She walked to the locker room in the basement. It was empty. The shift change had passed. She opened her locker, number 402. Inside, taped to the metal door, was a small, grainy photo. It wasn't of a child or a vacation. It was a Polaroid of a man with a thick beard and kind eyes, laughing at a camera. Liam, she touched the photo. She remembered the night he died. She was 30 years old, a school teacher then. He had collapsed in the kitchen. She had called 911. She had waited. She had trusted the system. She had trusted the ambulance. Trusted the ER triage nurse who said it was just indigestion. Trusted the doctor who didn't come for 45 minutes. Liam had died of a ruptured aortic aneurysm while waiting for a CT scan. He had died because everyone was following protocol, and no one was looking at the patient. That was the night Maren Kestler died, and the night the nurse was born. She had gone back to school. She had learned every protocol, so she would know exactly when to break them. She had spent 2 decades hardening herself into a weapon against incompetence, and now the system had disarmed her. She took off her scrubs. She folded them neatly, placing them in the laundry bin. She put on her civilian clothes, a gray sweater, dark jeans, sneakers. She looked like anyone else now, just a middle-aged woman carrying a tote bag. She shouldn't have gone upstairs. She should have walked out to her car and driven to her empty house. But she couldn't. She took the service elevator to the 4th floor. The ICU. She walked down the hallway, keeping her head down. The unit was quiet, the lights dimmed for the evening. She saw the heavy security detail outside room 404. 2 MPs with sidearms stood guard. She couldn't get close. But there was a waiting area opposite the room, separated by a glass partition. She sat there, pulling a magazine from her bag, pretending to read. Through the gap in the blinds, she could see into the room. Commander Rourke was there. He was hooked up to a forest of machines. A ventilator tube was taped to his mouth, and standing over him was Colonel Stryker. The surgeon was pointing at the monitor, explaining something to General Hannon. The general nodded, looking solemn, looking concerned. A photographer from the base public affairs office was there, snapping a picture of the general standing vigil by his fallen soldier. The lie was being cemented in real time. The hero general, the brilliant surgeon, the saved soldier, Maren watched them. She felt a deep, burning resentment, not for the credit, but for the arrogance. They treated the body in the bed like a trophy. Then she saw something. Stryker left the room. The general sat down in the chair, pulling out his phone. The MPs stared at the wall. Inside the room, Commander Rourke moved. It was a small movement. His hand, the one she had wanted to hold, twitched against the restraint. His eyes fluttered. He was fighting the sedation. The monitor above his bed flashed red, just for a second. High-pressure alarm. The ventilator was meeting resistance. The general didn't look up from his phone. The MPs didn't notice. The nurse at the central station was on a call. Maren sat up straight. She knew that alarm. She knew that movement. He wasn't just waking up. He was bucking the vent. If he coughed hard enough, with that fresh puncture in his pericardium, he could tear the clot. He could bleed out again. She was a civilian now. She was suspended. She was invisible. But the man in the bed was drowning in air, and the men in charge were too busy checking their emails to notice. Maren put the magazine down. She stood up. She walked toward the MPs. "Ma'am, restricted area," the guard said, stepping in front of her. "Family only." "I'm not family," Maren said, her voice dropping to that low, gravelly tone that had commanded the trauma bay. "But if you don't open that door, your commander is going to blow his cardiac repair in about 30 seconds. The guard blinked. "What?" "Look at the monitor." Maren pointed. Inside the room, the numbers were flashing angry red. Rourke's chest was heaving against the straps. The guard turned to look. Maren didn't wait for permission. She didn't wait for the general. She pushed past the guard, shoving the heavy glass door open. She was back in the room, back in the fire. And this time, there was no one to stop her. The room was a pressurized box of panic. The ventilator alarm wasn't just a noise. It was a rhythmic hammer blow to the senses. High peak pressure, high peak pressure. Commander Rourke was thrashing. His back arched off the mattress, his teeth grinding against the plastic bite block of the endotracheal tube. His eyes were wide, blown open in a terror that had no name. He was drowning on dry land, fighting the machine that was trying to force air into lungs that were too stiff, too terrified to accept it. General Hannon scrambled up from the chair, his phone clattering to the floor. "What is happening?" "Nurse," he shouted, looking toward the door, expecting the assigned ICU staff. Instead, he got Maren. She moved past him like a gust of wind. She didn't acknowledge his rank, his presence, or his previous threat to bury her. She went straight to the head of the bed. "Don't touch him!" Hannon roared, recognizing the silver hair, the gray sweater. "MP, get her out, now!" The two military police officers burst through the door, their boots heavy on the linoleum. Hands reached for Maren's shoulders, rough hands, hands trained to subdue combatants. "Let go of me," Maren said. She didn't scream. She didn't fight back. She simply planted her feet and leaned over the patient, her face inches from the commander's. "If you drag me out now, he tears the artery. Do you want to explain to the colonel why the patient bled out while you were wrestling a 54-year-old woman?" The sheer, cold logic of the statement made the MPs hesitate for a fraction of a second. That was all she needed. Maren placed her hands on Rourke's face. Her palms were cool. Her thumbs rested gently on his temples. She didn't look at the monitor. She looked into his eyes, eyes that were darting frantically, seeing enemies in the shadows of the ceiling tiles. "Declan," she said. It was the first time she had used his name, not his rank. "Commander," just the name his mother would have used. "Declan, look at me." Rourke continued to buck, his chest heaving against the rhythm of the vent. The machine hissed angrily, unable to deliver the breath. "Stop fighting," Maren commanded. Her voice dropped to a low, hypnotic register, the voice she had used to calm drug addicts, terrified children, and dying men for 3 decades. "The machine is helping you. "You are safe. You are in a hospital. I need you to let the air in." General Hannon stepped forward, his face red. "This is assault. I gave a direct order." "Quiet," Maren snapped, not turning her head. The word was a whip crack. It silenced the general instantly. The shock of being shooshed by a civilian freezing him in place. Maren kept her eyes locked on Rourke. She moved her left hand, the one with the burn scar, the white jagged map of her own trauma, down to his chest. She placed it directly over the sternotomy dressing, right over the heart she had decompressed an hour ago. She pressed down firmly, a grounding weight, an anchor. "Feel my hand," she whispered. "Breathe into my hand. On 3. 1, 2, 3. Rourke's eyes, wild and bloodshot, locked onto hers. He saw the grey in her hair. He saw the lines around her eyes. He saw a calm that was deeper than the ocean he operated in. He stopped fighting. His chest fell. The machine hissed, a smooth, long delivery of oxygen. The alarm stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the rhythmic whoosh, click of the ventilator. Ruth blinked. His heart rate on the monitor behind him began to drift down. 120. 190. He didn't look at the general. He didn't look at the MPs who were hovering uncertainly by the door. He stared at Maren. And then he moved his hand. It was slow, trembling with the aftershocks of anesthesia and trauma. His fingers, calloused and stained with faint traces of tactical ink, reached up. He grabbed Maren's wrist. He didn't push her away. He held on. His grip was weak, but desperate. He was a man falling off a cliff, and she was the ledge. Maren didn't pull away. She let him hold the scar on her hand. She ran her thumb over his knuckles. "I've got you," she whispered alive. "You made it?" General Hannon watched. He stood 3 feet away, paralyzed by a scene that fit none of his protocols. He saw his elite operator, a man trained to be a lethal, unfeeling instrument of war, clinging to a middle-aged nurse like a child in the dark. He saw the way Rourke looked at her. It wasn't the look of a soldier to a subordinate. It was the look of a survivor to a savior. For 10 seconds, the hierarchy of the world was suspended. There were no stars, no medals, just a woman's hand and a man's breath. Then the spell broke. "That's enough," Hannon said. His voice was quieter now, lacking the bombast, but filled with a cold, administrative finality. "Remove her." The MPs moved in, this time. They didn't hesitate. One grabbed Maren's left arm, the other her right. They pulled her back. Maren didn't resist. She let her hand slip from Rourke's grip. The commander's hand fell back onto the sheets. He tried to lift his head, his eyes following her, panic flaring briefly in his pupils before exhaustion took him back down. He made a sound around the tube, a low groan of protest. "He's stable," Maren said to the general as they dragged her backward toward the door. She wasn't pleading for her job. She was giving a handoff report. Watch his anxiety. If he fights the tube again, sedate him. Don't yell at him. Hold his hand. Get her out, Hannon said, turning his back on her to look at Rourke. They hauled her into the hallway. The glass door swung shut, muffling the sound of the ventilator. People were watching. Nurses from the station, visitors, the cleaning staff. They saw the charge nurse, the woman who had trained half of them, being escorted out like a criminal. Maren held her head up. She adjusted her sweater, which had been pulled askew by the MPs. "I can walk," she said to the young officer gripping her elbow. "I know the way." She had lost. The career was gone. The pension was gone. The reputation she had built brick by brick for 20 years was rubble. She would be blacklisted. She might be charged. But she could still feel the phantom pressure of Rourke's grip on her wrist. She could still see the terror drain from his eyes. She had traded her future for his breath. As they walked her toward the elevator, the heavy security doors of the IC unit beeped and locked behind her. Inside the room, General Hannon stood over the bed. He looked down at his soldier. Rourke was sleeping now, the rhythm steady. Hannon looked at the commander's hand, the hand that had reached out. He looked at his own hands, manicured and ringed. He reached out tentatively to pat Rourke's shoulder. Rourke flinched in his sleep. Hannon pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. He looked at the empty space where the nurse had stood. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It was accusatory. 3 days of silence is a long time when you have spent 30 years living in the noise. Maren sat on her back porch. It was raining. A slow, grey drizzle that turned the oak trees in her yard into blurred charcoal sketches. Her phone sat on the small wicker table next to a cup of cold tea. It hadn't rung. Not once. She had been erased. The hospital schedule had been updated. Her name was gone. Her access card was deactivated. The life she had built on the foundation of adrenaline and competence had been dismantled with the quiet efficiency of a delete key. She looked at her hands. The burn scar on her left hand seemed to ache in the damp weather. She rubbed it with her thumb. She wondered if he was dead. She had checked the obituaries in the local paper. Nothing. She had checked the news for announcements of a military casualty. Nothing. But in the world of special operations, death was often as silent as the mission. If Commander Rourke had died from an infection or a blown graft, they wouldn't announce it. They would just bury him. Maren took a sip of the cold tea. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was retired now. She could garden. She could read. She could stop waking up at 3:00 a.m. wondering if she had forgotten to check a potassium level. But the silence wasn't peaceful. It was a vacuum. 5 miles away, inside the pressurized quiet of the ICU, the silence was breaking. "Tube is coming out," Colonel Stryker announced. The respiratory therapist deflated the cuff. "Cough for me, Commander." Declan Rourke heved. His body convulsed a wet, violent spasm as the plastic snake was pulled from his throat. He gasped, sucking in raw, unfiltered air. His throat felt like it had been scrubbed with glass. "Easy," Stryker said, patting his shoulder. "Breathe. You're back with us." Rourke squeezed his eyes shut. The room spun. The lights were too bright. His chest throbbed with a dull, heavy atch where they had sawed through his sternum to fix the damage. "Water," he croaked. The word was barely a sound. A nurse, a young man Maren had trained, held a cup of ice chips to his lips. Rourke took them greedily, the cold melting the fire in his throat. He blinked, his vision clearing. He saw the uniforms first. General Hannon stood at the foot of the bed. He was in his dress blues now, looking immaculate, powerful and relieved. "Welcome back, son," Hannon said, a tight smile on his face. "You gave us a scare, but you're Navy. Tough to kill." Rourke tried to sit up, but his muscles failed him. He slumped back against the pillows. He looked at Stryker. "You," Rourke rasped. "I repaired the ventricular laceration," Stryker said, nodding confidently. "It was tricky. You had a significant pericardial effusion. We had to go in and evacuate the clot, stitch the myocardium. You're going to be fine, Commander. Full recovery." Rourke stared at him. His mind was a fragmented puzzle of pain and drugs, but there were pieces that were razor sharp. He remembered the darkness. He remembered the feeling of drowning. He remembered the pressure in his chest building until he thought his head would explode. And he remembered the voice. It wasn't Stryker's voice. It wasn't the general's. It was a woman. "Low? Gravelly. I've got you." "The woman," Rourke whispered. The room went still. Stryker stiffened. General Hannon clasped his hands behind his back, his smile faltering just a fraction. "There were a lot of nurses in and out," Hannon said smoothly. "Standard team rotation." "No," Rourke said. He found a reserve of strength in his diaphragm. "The one with the needle." Stryker cleared his throat. "Commander, as I said, I performed the surgery." The tamponade was relieved in the R. O'Rourke turned his head slowly. his eyes dark and sunken, locked onto the general. He was weak, but he was still a Tier 1 operator. He knew when he was being handled. He knew the texture of a lie. "I felt it," Rourke said. "Before the OR. In the trauma bay. I was the pressuring." It stopped. He looked at Vane, who was standing in the corner, holding the chart. Vane looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. "Who put the needle in my chest?" Rourke asked. The question was an order. Vane looked at the general. The general stared straight ahead. "It was an irregular procedure," Hannon said, his voice dropping. "There was a deviation from protocol. It has been handled. The individual responsible has been removed," Rourke repeated. "She was a liability," Hannon said, regaining his footing. "She took a risk that could have killed you. We don't reward recklessness, Commander. We maintain standards. Colonel Stryker saved your life. That is the official record." Rourke closed his eyes. He thought about the moment in this very room 3 nights ago. The machine fighting him, the hands on his face, the thumb rubbing his knuckles. "Feel my hand. Breathe into my hand." She hadn't just saved his heart. She had saved his mind. She had pulled him out of the panic spiral that kills soldiers just as dead as bullets do. "General," Rourke said softly. "Yes, son. Does the official record say I panicked?" Rourke opened his eyes. "Does it say I bucked the vent? Does it say I was terrified?" Hannon paused. "No. The record says you were sedated and stable." "So the record is a lie," Rourke said. "The record protects your reputation," Hannon countered, his voice hardening. "And the Navy's." Rourke looked at the ceiling. He felt the stitches pulling at his skin. He realized then what was happening. They were rewriting history to make it clean. They were erasing the messy, desperate truth that a middle-aged woman in a grey sweater had done what the men with the stars and the scalpels couldn't do. "I want to see her," Rourke said. "That is not possible," Hannon said. "She is a civilian. She is suspended. She is likely facing charges." "Drop them," Rourke said. "Excuse me." "Drop the charges," said. His voice was gaining traction. "And bring her here. Commander, be reasonable." Stryker interjected. "We have the press coming in 2 hours. The Secretary of the Navy is flying in tomorrow. We need to prep you for the statement. We need to focus on the team that." "I am the team leader." Rourke cut him off. The authority in his voice was absolute. "And I don't leave people behind." He looked at Hannon. "You want me to shake the Secretary's hand. You want the photop. You want the hero story. It's what the country needs, Declan," Hannon said. "Then you get the woman who kept me alive long enough for you to get the credit." Rourke said, "If she isn't standing in this room when the Secretary walks in, I don't say a word. I don't take the medal, and I tell the reporter exactly who put that needle in my chest." The silence that followed was total. It was the sound of a power structure shifting. It didn't happen with a shout or a gun. It happened because the one man who couldn't be ignored had just decided to speak. Hannon looked at Rourke. He saw the resolve. He realized with a sinking feeling that he had miscalculated. He had assumed Rourke would care about the protocol, but Rourke only cared about the result. "She's at home," Vane whispered from the corner. "I have her file." Hannon took a deep breath. He adjusted his cuff. He looked at the proud, defiant face of the soldier in the bed. "Get the car," Hannon said to his aide. "Sir?" the aide asked. "Get the car," Hannon repeated, his voice tired. "We have to go make a house call." Maren was washing her teacup when she saw the headlights. They swept across her kitchen window, cutting through the gloom of the rainy afternoon. It was a black SUV. Government plates. She turned off the faucet. She dried her hands on a dish towel. Her heart did a slow, heavy thud in her chest. They were here to arrest her. That was the only explanation. The board had met. The decision was made. And now they were here to take her in for practicing medicine without a license. She folded the towel. She smoothed her hair. She walked to the front door. She wouldn't make them break it down. She would walk out with her head up. She opened the door. Standing on her porch, unprotected from the rain, was General Hannon. Water dripped from the brim of his hat onto his ribbons. He looked uncomfortable. He looked out of place. He looked like a man who was swallowing a very large, very bitter pill. Behind him, the aide stood by the car door, holding it open. General said. She didn't step back. She didn't invite him in. Miss Kestler, Hannon said. He didn't yell. He didn't command. Are you here to take my license? Maren asked. Hannon looked at her. He looked at the modest house, the grey sweater, the face that had stared him down in the trauma bay. No, Hannon said. The commander is awake. Maren let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. He's okay. Persistent, Hannon said. He is refusing to cooperate with the debriefing. Why? Because you aren't there. Maren stared at him. The rain pattered against the porch roof. He wants to thank you, Hannon said, forcing the words out, frankly. He gave me an order. The general took a step back, gesturing toward the open car door. Get your coat, Maren, Hannon said. It was the first time he had used her first name. We are keeping the Navy waiting. The drive back to the hospital was conducted in a silence that felt heavier than the rain hammering against the roof of the SUV. General Hannon drove with both hands on the wheel at 10 and 2, his posture rigid. Maren sat in the passenger seat, her grey tote bag on her lap. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The power dynamic had shifted so fundamentally that language felt insufficient. The general, a man who moved armies, was currently acting as a chaffier for a suspended nurse because a bedridden soldier had given him no choice. When they pulled up to the emergency entrance, not the main lobby, but the ambulance bay where Maren had spent half her life, Hannon put the car in park. The Secretary of the Navy lands in 40 minutes, Hannon said, looking straight ahead through the windshield. The press is setting up in the conference room. The narrative is already written, Maren. We can't change the press release. I don't want to be in the press release, Maren said quietly. Hannon turned to look at her. For the first time. His eyes weren't hard, they were searching. Then what do you want? Maren looked at the sliding glass doors of the ER. She saw a trauma team rushing a gurney in. She saw the organized chaos she loved. I want to do my job, she said. And I want the mark off my record. I am not a liability, General. I am the safety net you didn't know you needed. Hannon nodded slowly. Done. They walked in together. The visual was jarring. The three-star general in full-dress blues, ribbons gleaming under the fluorescent lights, walking in step with a woman in jeans and a rain-dampened sweater. Heads turned. Dr. Vane, standing at the central station, dropped a pen. Sarah. The night charge stopped mid-sentence. They watched as the general held the door open for Maren Kestler. They took the elevator to the 4th floor. The ICU hallway was buzzing now. Suits, earpieces, the polished machinery of military public relations. Colonel Stryker was standing outside room 404, checking his watch. When he saw Maren, his jaw tightened, but he stepped aside. He had his orders. Maren walked into the room. Commander Rourke was sitting up, propped by pillows. He looked pale, the skin around his eyes bruised and dark, but he was alert. The ventilator was gone. The monitors were chirping a steady, rhythmic song of survival. When he saw her, he didn't smile. He didn't salute. He just stopped moving. You came, Rourke rasped. His voice was like grinding stones, raw from the intubation. I didn't have much of a choice, Maren said. Moving to the foot of the bed, she automatically checked the monitor. Heart rate 88, oxygen saturation 98%. Your blood pressure is good. My heart is working, Rourke said, looking at Hannon, then back to her. Because you didn't wait for permission. He lifted his hand. the same hand that had gripped her wrist in the terror of the awakening. He held it out, palm open. Maren hesitated. This wasn't professional protocol, but the room felt detached from the hospital rules. It was a private peace treaty. She stepped forward and took his hand. His skin was warm. The grip was firm. "They told me I was lucky," Rourke said, his eyes locking onto hers. "They said it was a miracle." He reached into the pocket of his hospital gown. His movements were slow, deliberate. He pulled out a small object. It was the Velcro patch. The trident. The one she had left on the counter in the trauma bay. "One of the cleaners found this," Rourke said. "It belongs on the gear of operator who completed the mission." He pressed the patch into Maren's palm. The rough embroidery scratched against her lifeline. "You don't have to wear it," Rourke whispered. "But you keep it. As a reminder." "A reminder of what?" Maren asked softly. "That rank doesn't save lives," Rourke said. "Competence does." He looked up at General Hannon, who was standing by the door, watching the exchange with a stoic, unreadable expression. "She stays on the team, General," Rourke said. "It wasn't a request. And if I ever end up on a table again, I want her in the room. Before Stryker. Before you." Hannon straightened his tunic. He nodded once. "Understood, Commander." The door opened behind them. A frantic aide stuck his head in. "General, the secretary is in the elevator. The press is ready for the photo op." The energy in the room shifted instantly. The machine was restarting. The lights were coming on. Maren squeezed Rourke's hand one last time, then let go. She stepped back away from the bed, away from the spotlight. "I need to go," Maren said. "I have a shift starting in 20 minutes, and I'm out of uniform." "Maren," Rourke said. She paused at the door. "Thank you," he said. "Simple. Final. Just breath, Commander," she replied. She slipped out of the room just as the entourage arrived. She passed the Secretary of the Navy in the hallway. A flurry of handshakes and flashbulbs. No one looked at the woman in the grey sweater pressing herself against the wall to let them pass. She took the service elevator down to the basement locker room. The silence down there was familiar. It smelled of bleach and old scrubs. She opened locker 402. She took out a fresh pair of blue scrubs. She pinned her badge back onto the collar. Maren Kestler, RN charge nurse. She looked at the patch in her hand. She couldn't wear it. It was against regulation. She opened the inside of her locker door. Right next to the picture of her husband, Liam, she used a small piece of medical tape to stick the trident patch to the metal. 2 men. One she couldn't save, and one she did. She closed the locker. The clang of the metal was the only applause she needed. She walked out of the locker room and headed for the stairs. As she pushed through the double doors of the emergency department, the noise hit the phones ringing, the distant siren approaching, the shout of a resident looking for a line. "Maren?" Vane called out from Trauma Bay 2. "I've got a multi-vehicle collision inbound. 2 minutes out. I need hands." Maren didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the general, or the commander, or the politics of the 4th floor. She snapped on a pair of gloves. She checked her pockets for saline flushes. She stepped up to the red line on the floor, where the ambulance would unload. "I'm here," Maren said, her voice cutting through the noise, calm and absolute. "Let's get to work." The bay doors opened. The siren wailed. And Maren Kestler stood ready, invisible to the world, but essential to its survival. True heroism rarely happens on a stage. It happens in the quiet moments when no one is watching. When a decision is made not for glory, but for life. It is found in the steady hands of those who refuse to wait for permission to do what is right. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been an honor to tell it to you. Would you like me to develop another narrative exploring a different kind of quiet heroism, perhaps in a courtroom or a cockpit?